CJOR, Sunday Dialogue. Here's Lloyd Brady.
In this morning's dialogue program, Bob Birch and Arthur Enns, my associates, are with me. And we're going to cover a book that some people utterly rebel against when they have to hold it in a court of law. And yet the same book provides inspiration to some and is a total guidance for life, almost hour by hour. And of course what we're talking about is the greatest selling and most popular of all books ever known to mankind, and that's the Holy Bible. So here we are trying to deal with a book of such substance as the Bible in about 30 minutes when great minds for the whole of their lives have never really been able to understand the mysteries of the book. But we have at least to help us on this morning's program two men who have a great deal of knowledge on it. And I'd like to introduce, first of all, Dr. Larry Hurtado. Welcome to our program, Larry.
Thank you very much.
And Dr. Clark Pinnock. And Clark, this is not the first time you've been on Dialogue.
No, I think we've met before.
Yeah. Where do we start? Perhaps it's appropriate to say Christmas is just behind us, well, for this year at least. And why don't we ask the question? We've been talking and thinking and worshiping Jesus Christ. So let's ask how historical the Bible really is in relation to what we see in the Scriptures.
Well, mentioning Christmas, of course, points out so clearly what the heart of the Bible is, that it is an account of something that God has done, that God has intervened in history for us, and that the Bible is, first of all, a historical witness to these events. So it's of the essence that it be a reliable account, and it's good to know that we have in the New Testament 4 documents, slightly different from each other, but which present in a combination a very fine and strong witness to Christ and his historical veracity.
Is it just a matter of opinion as to how accurate these documents really are?
I think it's a matter of informed opinion. I mean, we have texts to go on, very many in ancient texts, more than we do for in the case of Aristotle or Plato. And then we have archaeological and cultural parallels, both on the Jewish and Roman and the Greek side, which help to show that these documents do speak of the time accurately and give us a good testimony. So I think it's an opinion, but it's an informed one.
In a moment, we'll come to the archaeological findings, which I'm sure a lot of people would be interested in. But we talk the Bible as being a book, but really, Larry, it is really a collection of books, is it not?
That's right. Each one of the books of the Bible was that. It was a separate production and has its own history and its own author and its own circumstances for which it was written. And that's why, while all of these books are put together and put in one volume today and published, one is not understanding that volume correctly if one goes to the Bible flipping from one page to the next, failing to recognize that there are different authors, and failing to recognize, for example, that the literature contained in it was written over a period of well over 1,000 years. And so we have diverse cultural situations, as a matter of fact, 2 mainly different languages used, and different cultures involved, different situations calling forth the different writings. Even when we come to the writings of one man, such as the Apostle Paul, that span only perhaps a decade or so, they are written, however, to different situations, and that has to be taken into account. Otherwise, one is going to not be using the Bible correctly. One is going to be coming up with what appear to be contradictory, confusing kinds of conclusions.
Could I just, what you say there leads me to ask this question. Does one have to be a scholar then to read the Bible? Maybe many of our listeners would say, well, then I can't attempt to understand it.
What you mentioned earlier about the difficulty of understanding the mysteries of the Bible, I found myself both agreeing and disagreeing. That is, I found myself saying, it's my conclusion that given a translation of the Bible in a language that one can understand, and given an ability on the part of the reader to read his language well enough and understand it in a normal sort of intelligence, it seems to me that a person with little or no experience other than that should be able to read the Bible, assuming that he's not assuming that life has not caused him to be so prejudiced and so embittered inside that he's unable to respond to things. He should be able to read the Bible and get from it the basic notion of its message, which is man, a creature of God, in a state of alienation and in need of what the Bible calls a forgiveness and a redemption, a restoration, which God has done and ultimately done in the coming of Jesus Christ. Now, that basic message, I think most Christians would say, is probably sufficient to spell the difference between eternal happiness or not. And that sort of message, it seems to me, is fairly simple to understand, assuming that one does not get lost in a welter of details. It is those details, however, that present a great deal more difficulty for a person, precisely because the various books of the Bible were written in particular historical situations. And the less we know about those historical situations, the more difficult some of the allusions and minor details are.
But how do you know you've got the right interpretation? Because there are people in the world who use the Bible to back up one kind of religion and use the Bible to back up another kind, and some people preach love on the Bible, and other people preach prejudice on the basis of the Bible. How do you know when you're understanding it right?
Well, I think one thing that you've mentioned is that we can, as the old saying is, you can prove anything by using the Bible. But if I may say so, I think that's the problem that we must avoid, is we must avoid using the Bible. We must allow the Bible to use us, so to speak. That is, we must ask ourselves, not can I find justification for what I already believe in the Bible, because you can find justification or apparent justification for almost anything if you come to the Bible with that. But the effort should be made, it seems to me, in saying, I'm not so sure that I do know the Bible. I'm not so sure that I do understand what all truth is. So I'm going to try to allow the Bible to tell me what truth is, rather than trying to find justification for what I already think the truth is. And I think if we take that attempt, a lot of distortions and errors that characterize the history of so-called Bible study could be done away with.
What are the two languages that the Bible was originally written in, Larry?
Well, for the most part, the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. There are some portions of the book of Daniel that appear in Aramaic, which is a dialect similar to Hebrew. The New Testament is written entirely in Greek of the Hellenistic period, which would be the period between Alexander the Great and the fall of the Roman Empire.
Larry, sometimes if you were to speak about a certain portion of Scripture from the Bible, you would refer to the Greek meaning of certain words. Now, the average person wouldn't have that background, and sometimes the shades of meaning in the words are quite important, are they not, to the actual text, what is being discussed?
Very much so. It's very difficult to put all of these delicate shades of meaning, not only from Greek, but if a person is familiar with any language, such as the two languages that are native here in Canada, French and English. A person who has learned very much of both of those languages will recognize that it's difficult to put across one idiom in another language, even though we're talking about two European languages that are basically of the same family of languages and very similar still. There's a cultural difference between the two. It makes that difficult. And the same thing is true of the languages that the Bible is written in. That's the reason why if a person wants to learn some detail about shades of meaning and associations that are not immediately apparent, he has to make use of Bible dictionaries and commentaries, and that means that specialists have to be trained, such as myself, and so we earn our living doing that sort of thing.
Right. Now, if I was a skeptic, and I would say, well, you asked me to believe the words that are in the Bible because if you're a believer, you believe in them. But now I'm a skeptic, and I say, well, what historical facts have you got to support what's in the Bible? How historically factual is the Bible?
Just have to think about how we know any of ancient history through the testimonies that have survived from early periods and from letters and correspondences and historical writings. And so if the Bible can be checked out according to the criteria normally employed to ascertain such things in any field, then we can say that the Bible is a good historical source, and that is in fact the case. For example, someone in Oxford did a study on the details in the trial narratives in the Gospel and Acts, Gospels, and found that in detail they corresponded to what we know about Roman law in the first half of the first century, but not what we know of it a century later. And he concluded that the detail was so impressive that these documents were either written in the first half of the first century or else knew exactly what went on then in order to have it so precise, since Roman writers like Tacitus, writing a few years later, couldn't get the details right because they kept inserting anachronisms into their own writing because they'd forgotten the changes. So, although we don't have detailed proof for all of the things in the Bible by any means, and many things are still unverified, yet overall the Bible stands very high in the estimation of someone who is interested in historical criteria.
What kind of evidence is there from a manuscript perspective of the Bible's accuracy?
Well, a few years ago at the Dead Sea Scroll community, when we discovered so many interesting sectarian Jewish documents, we found many of the texts of the Testament. And in one case, we found a major text of the prophet Isaiah, which dated, I think, close to 1,000 years before the major manuscripts we had before. And we found that the differences were very slight, showing that the Jewish people who transmitted the text were meticulous in their accuracy and giving us tremendous confidence in the reliability of their work. In the New Testament, of course, we have thousands of texts and fragments from very early times about it, quite surpassing any other ancient book. And therefore, on that basis alone, the Bible needs to be looked at with great attention.
I've heard that the Jewish scribes, who were the people who copied Scripture, had some very strict rules as to how they did their work. Can you tell us something about that?
Well, I think Larry could say more probably, but I know that they counted their letters and made it, like when they copied out the manuscript, they made notes in the margin how many letters they had copied so that they wouldn't miss any of them out. And that's an example. Maybe Larry has something else to say.
Well, it's true that particularly the Masoretes, that is the people who copied the Hebrew Scriptures in the first few hundred years of the Christian era, were especially meticulous at this. They got it down to probably the closest thing that there is to a science of copying by hand, just before the printing press was invented. And as Clark has mentioned, there were rigorous efforts to keep track of the number of letters in each writing, and if a scribe made a mistake, he would very often, in some cases, go through the ritual of washing himself and washing his pen, and because it was the documents were endowed with an almost magical kind of significance, you see, and so by omitting a letter or misspelling a word, he felt somehow almost done blasphemy. So he was extremely careful about that. Now, it's not to say that mistakes did not creep in, because the most fine-tuned effort of being flawless in human life has yet to produce a person who succeeds.
Even Xerox machines can break down.
Quite. And so I think that has to be said as well regarding the historical details that were mentioned earlier. And that is that it's not just that the Bible, where it is given historical references, is accurate. It is amazingly accurate in comparison to, the intentions of the authors. When we pause to reflect that the intentions of the authors was not primarily to give us ancient history, but only to pick up and refer to details that we call ancient history, so as to give a context for the real truth that they were talking about. Their real interest, of course, is to tell us who God is, and in their view, and what man is like, what his need of God is, and so on.
The history was just incidental, really.
It's almost incidental in many cases, though it's true to say that the revelation of God in the Hebrew and biblical thought is always a revelation in history. Israel believed that God had chosen her and called her to be a special nation. Why? Not primarily because somebody sat around meditating and came up with this idea, but they continually pointed back to the events of the Exodus, the deliverance of Israel from Egypt, the awesome events in connection with the parting of the water and the people going out of the land, this mass exodus of the slave population. It was that historical event that gave them the justification for saying God cared for them. They knew that God cared for them because they interpreted that event as an act of God on their behalf. So history is not just incidental. It is the stuff of revelation. But I'm saying that treating those events the way we want them treated, that is, saying that Exodus occurred at a particular time, or saying that that Jesus was born at a particular time, that it happened during such and such a reign, or in such a place, those kinds of details, which enable us, with our interest, to lock in events are in many cases almost accidental, it appears. And certainly they were not attempting to give us a full-blown treatment of ancient history. So I think that the Bible's accuracy has to be seen as particularly remarkable on that score. Also, when we take into account that sort of what appears to us impreciseness with historical details is characteristic not of the Bible alone, but of all of ancient writing on that score. They did not have an absolute calendar such as we do. 1975, they would say, in the third reign of such and other king, and then it's up to you to find out when that king lived and what the third year of his reign was. You see, that sort of comparatively imprecise dating and locking in of events is characteristic of all ancient historical writing.
So historical or secular historical evidence, along with archaeological findings, have borne out a lot of the historical detail of the Bible. But it's another thing to accept some of the supernatural things which are recorded in the Bible. A lot of people have trouble with the first part of Genesis, Jonah and the whale, and things like that.
Well, I think that's true. The first thing that always has to be done, though, is to ask ourselves, what is the biblical writer trying to say at that point? And there again, when we come to an account like the account of Jonah, or the early accounts in Genesis, in the early part of Genesis, the Hebrew phraseology there says, and the Lord God made man out of the dust of the earth, and the verbs that are used there are verbs used to describe somebody making something out of a lump of clay, a potter. Now, probably the writer did not intend, however, for us to actually imagine God stooping over a lump of clay on the ground and fashioning with fingers a little clay dummy and then actually giving it mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and breathing into it life. These are all figurative terminology, quite apparent there. So we must be sure to ask ourselves very clearly, are we very, very sure what the writer is saying? And in some cases, coming at it from, again, Western eyes, we do not deal in figurative language very well, but an Oriental person is steeped in that. He doesn't know any other way to talk. The Hebrew language in particular tends to express abstractions in concrete language, figurative language. The Old Testament says, God is my tower and my rock. Well, now, he doesn't want us to think that God is a big boulder somewhere, or that he's some sort of a pinnacle. What does it mean to say God is my rock and my tower? Well, we have to ask that question and say, well, now, what did it mean for a man in the 9th century before Christ to say, God is my rock and my tower? That may take a little thinking and perhaps even a little historical research. So that's the first question when we approach all such matters in the Bible that pose us difficulties. Are we sure that we know what the writer intends us to understand? Because in many cases we pose difficulties that the writer is not intending us to pose.
Is there any way to know when figurative language is being used and when it's not?
I think in most cases, yes. In a great number of cases, the writer will let us know. He will indicate that it's figurative. In other cases, the context will implicitly let us know. As I've indicated, when it talks about God fashioning man out of the mud of the earth, the words used there are words used to describe somebody working with a piece of a potter's wheel. In view of the rest of what we know about the biblical concept of God, it's extremely unlikely that the writer really intends us to think of a sort of a form crouched over in the dust working with a clay dummy. That doesn't seem to harmonize with the rest of the lofty kind of transcendent notion of God that's taught in the Bible. So putting two and two together, we sort of say, well, this must mean that the writer is using the only kinds of words that he could use to express the ineffable, the origin of human life, and describing it as an act of God. The point being of that passage that the writer is saying that human life is a result of God's initiative and God's creation. It's not an accident. It's not a misfortune. It was done by God deliberately and with purpose.
But do all those details, for example, in Genesis 1, have significance?
I think they do. I think that obviously we must ask ourselves, why would a writer bother writing what he wrote? Only if it was of some meaning to him. Only if he understood that he was trying to say something. And we're not always sure, truly, what the writer intended to have said. But that becomes our quest as best we can to say now. We must presume that every word that the writer put in had some kind of significance or meaning, every thought. What was it?
But one of the important things there for biblical scholarship is to help us know what his point was in relation to the issues of his day. One of the tragedies, for instance, with Genesis 1 has been that it has been read in terms of how it would relate to Darwin, writing 2,000 or 3,000 years later, rather than what it would mean to a Babylonian creation story, which was circulating at the time and which the Genesis account refutes in its theology. So therefore we must learn to find out what points he was making, and part of that comes from a historical study.
But still left with the question, when I'm starting reading the Bible right from the beginning, where do I know where the writer stops using figurative language and where he starts referring to actual history?
Part of this has to be gained from simply practice. That is, we're talking about a volume of literature that comes from 10,000 to 15,000 miles away, the Near East, Palestine area. We're talking about a body of literature, the last portions of which were written 1,800 to 1,900 years ago, 1,800 years ago. We're talking about literature that came from, that was written in another language and with varying situations involved. So you can't just pick that up any more than you could pick up if you were a person that had dropped off from outer space somewhere and picked up a copy of the Gettysburg Address or the Queen's last address to Parliament. You would probably not be able to make sense of half of it unless you knew something of the events that were going on, either in this year or 1863, as the case may be. And the same thing is true of the Bible. Now, that only goes to say that the Bible is really rooted in history. It's not a fairy tale. It's not a volume of timeless kinds of metaphysical truths. It's talking about real nitty-gritty things that the biblical writers claim that God did. But that very strength also means that we have a responsibility of taking it seriously as a historical writing and trying to get into that.
I'd like to make a suggestion to someone who has never read the Bible before. Just because it is a library more than a book written by a human author, I would suggest that we start at the center of the Bible rather than at the first. And by the center, I mean, Paul said that the Bible was written to make us wise unto salvation through faith that is in Christ. And that's the way Jesus looked at it. He was the heart of the Bible. He's what it's really about, not some ancient king list, but he who is the King of Kings. And therefore we should start with the Gospels and with the simple New Testament teaching in Acts and in the epistles, and then work out, like in ripples, perhaps, to the edges, and perhaps Genesis would come in rather later under that system of reading.
Just one more question along the line that I was taking. There are some people, and probably some churches, who take the approach that, they kind of explain every supernatural event in the Bible as having symbolic significance and not really reflecting historical fact. When it comes down to things like the miracles that Jesus did and something a little more recent than Genesis 1, how do you regard that?
Well, I think it has to be taken, first of all, again, we have to ask ourselves, what is the writer really trying to say? And if we are quite sure that the writer is not, in fact, intending his language to be taken symbolically, if the writer believes that the event really happened and intends us to believe that, then it has to be taken very seriously. Now, the basic objection that seems to me has been launched against that sort of narrative in the Bible has been an a priori, that is, the view that those things don't happen, period. Therefore, it didn't happen. Now, that sounds very logical when you first look at it, but then when you look at it again, that doesn't sound very logical. These things don't happen, therefore that didn't happen. It seems to me rather our conception of whether these things happen or not has to be built the other way around. We must ask ourselves, is there a pretty good case for that thing having happened? If there is, maybe, by George, those sorts of things happen after all. Is
there evidence concerning some of the supernatural things recorded in the New Testament?
Well, by their very nature, you see, a historical event is an event which can be generally defended as having happened in one of two or three ways. One is if you can show sufficient cause for something happening, or if it's the sort of cause that regularly is observed. That is, I come rushing into you and I say, I planted a grapefruit seed in a coffee can full of dirt a month ago, and I've got a little green thing sticking up through the ground. And you say to me, that's not unusual. The process of dropping seeds in earth and green things coming up has gone on many, many times. Yeah, I think that there's adequate reason to believe that really happened. We've seen it happen many other times. But when you come to something like a miracle, what we call a miracle is, by its very definition, something that isn't repeated, and the cause for which does not lie within the normal courses of nature. Therefore, that becomes understandably more difficult to swallow, quite frankly, because it's not something that's regularly observed. And we have to posit a cause other than the normal operations of planting and sowing and other such life forces. What evidence can you use to defend that kind of thing happening? Well, you have two types, it seems to me. One is documentation for it. People who swear that it happened or who say that it happened, and we have no reason to necessarily distrust them. A second is the effects of that event. Do we observe effects that appear to be consonant with the event itself?
Are you thinking of any example now?
Well, for example, how do we, if the resurrection of Christ did not occur, and if Jesus did not really appear to his disciples, then we have for ourselves the responsibility of explaining the fact that a group of honest men say that it did happen. A group of men who were willing to die for their views, and whose lives reflect such transformation and such power and such integration that was not there before, that we're very hard. We have to explain that some other way. And we have to project a cause for the early Christianity, at least as significant as early Christianity was. And it was, in fact, a very significant kind of force and power in the first century. So we've got to project something as a cause for that, at least as significant as that, at least as powerful as that. And if it wasn't the resurrection of Jesus that provoked early Christianity, then what was it? And it won't do to just sit around and say, well, it was a group of people who chewed on an obscure kind of mushroom until they got silly ideas. It was sort of a general mixing together of ideas in the culture of the time, and they just sort of somehow came together in a constellation, and there was a new idea. That sort of thing won't do. That's very fuzzy historical kind of work. You've got to come up with something very clear that is a better explanation than what the biblical writers claim to be.
Well, Arthur, we've spent a very informative and interesting half hour. We, as a matter of fact, know that we have so much material to record that we're only going to use half of it for this Sunday's dialogue. So we're going to close now and continue with this subject, the Holy Bible, next week. We've been speaking on this program with Dr. Larry Hurtado and Dr. Clark Pinnock, both professors at Regent College on the campus of the University of British Columbia. We'd like you to be listening next week, again, when we'll have our same guests on Dialogue.
You've been listening to Sunday Dialogue on CJOR. If you have any questions or comments on this morning's broadcast, we invite your calls at 685-6464. That's 685-6464. And we hope you'll join us again next week at the same time for another 30 minutes of Sunday Dialogue.